Greetings, class, and welcome to African Black Psychology in the American Context. This is the second mini lecture that I'm providing for you all to begin our discussions on the topic of African Black psychology. Today, we'll answer the question, why African Black psychology? So when we think about this term, African Black psychology, the goal is to understand the behavior of African people from an African cultural context. So when we consider why we need an African Black psychology, we first have to delve into the history of African people. African people in this country and across the world have been oppressed. As a result, we struggle with factors related to our cultural identity and who we are. So we have this African Black psychology because currently African people don't act in a way that is congruent with their culture, their history, their background. So the goal in establishing an African Black psychology is to kind of undo some of the challenges that African people face. Those folks who are very serious about African Black psychology argue a couple of things. One, African people must write to and for our own race and community. As African people, our thoughts direct our actions. And if we are thinking outside of our African minds, then our actions and our behaviors don't reflect what an African person should do and or be. So we must move our understanding of what African people need to be connected to the goal of liberation for African people. What liberation means could be subjective, but the idea is that African people need to be free. So in this course, we want to talk about how the liberation for African people ultimately is psychological in its foundation, and the solution for fixing and reclaiming the minds of African people happens with a psychological process, a psychological solution. I wanted to go back also to the importance of reordering the African existence based on enslavement and oppression, which we'll talk about in chapter 2. African people have not been able to effectively think inside of our African minds. So when we have an African Black psychology, we have a study of the mind that looks at an African perspective of existence, an African perspective of being, and most importantly, deals with how African people have contributed to the world. So when looking at or attempting to ask the question, why African Black psychology, we need to understand who African people are and who African people should be, what forces impact who African people are, and what we need to do to change and or improve the existence of African people. We can directly connect things like stress, anxiety, mental emotional issues to oppression. We can connect it to racism, and the history of racism, of course, directly connects to enslavement. So if we want to reorder the African mind, we do have to understand that American psychology has operated in virtual ignorance of the existence of anything of an authentic African cultural reality. So Africa, we will talk about in this course. We'll dig very deep into different components of the continent of Africa. Primarily, we'll cover that in chapters 2, and we'll later on, of course, throughout the course, deal with looking at the world from an African worldview perspective. So making sure we talk about how we see the world from an African lens. We'll talk about that. That's chapter 3. Okay, not to digress. So in Africa, we'll talk about concepts related to Africa. And ultimately, we want to understand African Black psychology has been in existence from ancient times. And it is the solution to the problems that African people face. So when Black people or African people are viewed and understood through our own unique racial and cultural reality, we can accurately be portrayed in terms of our psychological makeup and mental health. So again, we just argued that Western or European psychology has operated in virtual ignorance of the existence of African people having a unique cultural reality. So if we study the Black mind and African culture as it relates to Blackness, then we'll be able to look at how African people think, how African people feel, how African people behave. Black African, I'll use interchangeably throughout the course, but in doing so, we're going to dig into understanding African consciousness, the African mind, and that is very important to then deal with the mental health of African people. So African Black psychology, we've stated so far at least, is important to understanding what is needed for sovereignty for African people, what is needed for healing African people comprehensively, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. So African Black psychology will be used, is an important tool to heal the damage that has been caused post enslavement and a bunch of other factors. Okay, moving on. Went over several points of why African Black psychology is important. So we need to look a little bit at the history of African Black psychology. So the reascension of African Black psychology has emerged over the past 50 to 70 years. What that means is that although Western European psychology has operated in virtual ignorance of any knowledge of African cultural reality and actually kind of created problems around that, the reascension of African Black psychology is an important note because it's saying it's unfolded over the past 70 years, but to reascend means that it was already in existence. So we'll talk about ancient Kemet and how that was used in terms of ancient Kemet. In ancient Kemet, we studied the mind, or Saku, which is known as the soul. So we're saying that it's unfolded over the past 50 to 70 years. What that means is that the African people have dug more into understanding African concepts of the mind and looked back historically at times such as ancient Kemet where African people really studied the mind. All right. So we have to understand that information is powerful and it controls how we think, how we feel, how we behave. So the more we get information about African history, African culture, the better we'll be able to understand and interpret the oppression, the anxiety, the depression, the things that African people experience. And that way we'll be able to move towards healing. So the reascension of African Black psychology, another important note, has occurred mostly in North America. So you'll find that in North America, primarily researchers, theorists, scholars have begun to dig into what African Black psychology is and how it existed historically. Scholars such as Wade Nobles, for example, who has a text called Seeking the Saku. And when I say we, I'm referencing myself as your instructor, but Dr. Kobe Kambon as the scholar who wrote the text and created the course that you are taking right now. So another important note about the reascension of African Black psychology, it has been associated with Africans who have trained in psychology primarily from a cultural perspective. So that means African Black psychologists are cultural, and throughout the semester you'll see some infusions of culture and ideas of culture as we progress through the course. And all right, so Africa is going to be a very instrumental part of the course. And we'll stop. Am I going to stop here? Mini lecture. Okay, we're going to stop here. This is my second time doing a recording, but it has stressed me all the way out. I'm going to post it anyway. And you can like, comment, whatever. I tried my best. I think it came out okay. But I decided to stop here and we're going to pick up because I wanted to be mini lecture. So we're going to pick up on discussions of Africa in the next mini lecture. Thank you. And please feel free to put questions or comments in the chat. And hopefully I addressed everything. And Ashe. Did I say I'm Dr. Slater Sarah? Peace.